Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
Well, happy 2020 to you.
Oh my god.
I act like we never talk, by the way.
Yeah. We only talk during our podcasts and never any other time.
Yeah, we actually hate each other and never speak.
Yeah, 2020, there's just something terrifying about that number.
I know. It doesn't seem real.
It doesn't help that 2020 has already been a dumpster fire of a year.
I know. It really has. And, I mean, it's America's fault. Let's be real.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And since, I mean, I've been thinking about Australia a lot, and I know we have a lot of listeners there, so
yes. Sending
loving thoughts to Australia.
I know. I can't even think about it too much because it's so sad.
I know. Yeah, I saw this thing. It was an article, and the title was basically, it was a climate scientist, and the headline was "Things That Keep Us Up at Night." And I was like, oh shit. Yeah, I guess being a climate scientist is kind of like a real shit experience.
I mean, we've seen these kind of articles for a long time now because they're like, we know it's coming. And now we saw this was coming, and here it is.
Oh,
and I'm still mad at some of my friends who would say things like, oh, this is all overblown. Well,
I know.
Was it?
Right. Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah. Let's talk about language.
Yes, sorry. Hi, the world is ending.
Let's pretend it's not, just briefly.
Yes, for about an hour.
As Film Essaying pointed out to us.
On Twitter,
Sharon Choi, who translated for Bong Joon-ho, who won for Parasite, which is an amazing film if you haven't seen it.
At the Golden Globes, right? Best foreign language film.
Right. And everyone was praising his speech that he gave in Korean, but really the words that we heard, that we understood, unless you're a Korean speaker, but for those of us who aren't, were Sharon Choi's, not translator, interpreter, her interpretation of his words. And so what we heard was, once you overcome the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles, you will be introduced to so many more amazing films, which is true. I love his films. The ones that I've seen anyway are all really great. And mostly in Korean. As actually TK of AK, or Ask a Korean, on Twitter says, a more direct and worse translation, or whatever, for Bong's remark might be, the barrier called subtitles, well, it's not even really a barrier. It's barely an inch. Once you jump over that barrier, you can enjoy many more films. So that's a more literal translation of what he said.
Huh. So the sentiment is still, I think, 100% there.
Mm-hmm.
She said it in a way that feels very poetic, because it was like, I don't know, I guess in English at least it was less words. It was like, I don't know what it is about it.
It was pithier.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for, exactly. But I feel the same, like hearing that more direct translation of it, the sentiment for me is exactly the same.
The sentiment's the same. It's just slightly more awkward, which makes sense because when you're speaking on the fly,
right.
You can say the most beautiful things in the most awkward ways.
Listen, that's how I feel about everything I say on this podcast.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Because we're not speaking from a script, so yeah.
No. Well, no shit. Everyone's like, no shit, you aren't.
Wouldn't it be hilarious if we did write this all out?
Oh my god. If we wrote this all out, I think we'd actually be pretty good at dialogue.
Yeah, no, it would be a really good skill for sure.
So I saw that, and of course, it's Niall DeMarco, the deaf actor and model that I follow on Twitter. He was like, deaf and hard of hearing people have been saying this forever. Because subtitles make films accessible for them. And I think about this because growing up, I had the privilege of I'm hearing, my parents are hearing, so I just didn't grow up in a family where we watched subtitled films or any foreign films. When I was younger, I was like, that's what, rich people do. They watch foreign films. So I thought it was like a privileged or, a privileged thing to be able to watch foreign films. I never thought about it as an accessibility issue until I was older.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess it is a privilege, but it's not a privilege in the sense of it costs the same as any other movie.
Right.
So it's not an economic issue.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, but there are people, I guess, who can't, who are not super literate. And so maybe for them, we don't want to say, if you can't read subtitles, then you're worthless or anything like that. No. But if you can, you should try.
Yeah.
There's many, many, many great films that are subtitled.
Yeah. And I don't know, I don't have dyslexia, but it might be uncomfortable too for people who have dyslexia. Although I have seen some dyslexic people share the type of font that you use may be more helpful. So
yes.
I wonder if that's been done, if people have made subtitles using that kind of font or anything. Anyway, if you know, let us know. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I will say that not all subtitling it's not all equal. So that sometimes the way that they're okay, so there's always the choice that you're making, right? Mm-hmm. When you're translating a movie, do you say it more directly or do you say it more poetically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But also there's the font choice or even the color of the font. Yeah. So sometimes it's hard to read. It's been better more recently than in the past, but there have definitely been movies where I'm I'm glad that I have super great eyesight, or with my glasses so tiny, anyway.
Yeah.
But I can actually read this, but it's really hard, and so
But sometimes I just don't think that they're as large as I would like them to be.
Which is there's another constraint, right? Because if you make them too big, then you're covering up stuff.
It's true.
Some visual information, so it's tricky. But
anyway. Actually, this is kind of related to what we're talking about today with our guests, because I was thinking about how sometimes, with Dairy Girls, which is they're usually it's Irish English, and I sometimes put subtitles on just so that I can understand some of the words better. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we speak the same language, right?
Right.
But I'm enjoying the show. Sometimes it takes me a little bit harder to work through what they're saying if I'm not also reading subtitles.
Right. Yes.
Yes, and we talk about that today. That's today with our guests.
Well, we don't talk about subtitles, but we do talk about the difficulties of understanding mostly non-native accents, but also some native accents that are very different from our own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And what that means to process that and how it is more difficult, but not a barrier that cannot be surpassed. With practice,
yes, it's all about
you
practice.
Get better. You do. Just like anything.
Yeah, and if subtitles help, then definitely you should use them. There's no shame. No shame.
Is there some people, or are there some people that think that there's shame?
Yes.
Oh,
yes. Yes.
We're so good at shaming ourselves and each other.
Yes. I don't even want to get started on that topic because, oh boy.
I know. When did this become therapy?
I think the very first episode.
It's true. It's really true. And so, so we wanted to make one note before we go over to our guests, is that we talk about native and non-native accent. And that's just one way of talking about it. I think Carrie, have you heard other ways people talk about native versus non-native?
I'm sure there are other ways of talking about it, but I don't think I know of another way of saying it.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I want to put out that we don't mean to other, right? It's just
other
one way of talking about
L1 and L2, which is the way that, linguists talk about it. But outside of that, no.
So this is an accessible way of talking about it because we all understand what we're talking about. But we do want to make a point that everyone has an accent.
It's impossible to not have an accent.
Exactly.
I was editing a novel for the very first time.
Oh.
And in this novel, one of the characters basically has been turned into a cyborg. and the author describes this person as not having an accent, and I was just like, because they're computerized, but I was like, nope, there's still an accent there, because there's still like pronunciation choices that you're making.
That's true.
For the computer program that's creating the sounds. Anyway.
Oh, that's a good point, because Siri definitely does not know how to pronounce some Spanish words in the way they are pronounced in Spanish.
Right.
So,
well, also she's got an accent. Well, I mean, the original Siri has a California accent, because that's where that woman, the voice.
Yes, of course, that makes sense.
The voice actor comes from. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. Oh wait, that's a person.
It's a person.
It's not computerized.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
I didn't know that.
The sounds are from, the words are from a person. Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah, you didn't know that? You can follow her on Twitter, or at least you used to be able to.
Huh. I mean, okay, that makes sense. So they're taking words that she said individually and then putting them together. So that's why it sounds like a robot to me. Yeah.
It's obviously not fluid human speech.
Right.
But it is human speech, yeah.
Yes. Oh, well, I learned something. Time to call it quits for the day at 11 in the morning.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Today we have Dr. Melissa Mashad Bays-Burke, who's an associate professor, and David M. and Nancy L. Petrone faculty scholar in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Oregon. She's also the director of the Second Language Acquisition and Teaching Certificate Program and the director of undergraduate studies. In her research, she focuses on phonology and phonetics, examining speech perception and production, with special attention to non-native speakers and listeners. First, before we start on the question we really want to talk about, can you explain what speech perception and speech production are?
Sure. Those are good questions. So when I talk about speech perception, I'm talking about how we go from the acoustic signal or the sort of sound waves that hit our eardrum to coming up with a linguistic message. So I'm interested in everything that happens during that process. So how we turn those sound waves into meaningful sounds, and then how we combine those sounds to make words that we can understand. And then I basically stop at the words more than moving up to the sentences. And then for production, I'm talking about the other side of that process, which is how we go from having some sort of linguistic message that we know we want to convey, some idea that we want to convey, and how we turn that into speech sounds. I do work primarily on speech, but a lot of the stuff that I talk and think about, I think, can also be applied to signed languages. I just focus on the speech side. So when I say speech, I'm mostly talking about the sound side of things, but I think a lot of it can be applied to other modalities as well.
And I think that's a really important, I'm glad that you asked, Carrie. I think about production and perception all the time as someone who looks at how babies perceive sounds. Because I'm looking at babies before they even start producing things. And I think so much about how we know so much before we're able to produce something. And I think that can be said about adults too, where we are doing so much internal calculus before we respond to someone or when we're taking in the message. So that's what we really wanted to talk to you about today, because we're doing a lot of that. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, discrimination that can come out when we're doing that internal calculus. And we're all guilty. That's why, again, having the podcast, it's like, I've been there. We have all of these biases that that are at play when we hear speech. So
Right.
yeah, really glad to have you on the show. So
Good. I'm glad to be here.
So you also look at the interaction between speech perception and speech production. So how do they interact?
That's a really good question. It's something that's super complex, and we're still trying to figure this out. So, one common assumption has been that speech perception and production are basically the same processes, just in reverse. So one ends with an ear and one ends with a mouth, and everything else in between is exactly the same. And I think because of what Megan was just saying, we know really that that can't be true, because we can perceive so much more than we can produce, and there are different factors that impact these two processes really differently. So what we're interested in specifically in the lab is how they interact during learning, which seems to be something that is really, really complicated. So I think everybody has had an experience, or many people have had experiences in classrooms or learning a second language where you feel like you're not able to express the things that you want to express, even if you can understand them. And I have always been a person who's like that. And I've been very jealous of my friends who it feels like the oral fluency comes really easily to them, but then you put them in a naturally communicative situation and they can't understand what somebody's saying maybe. And so we're interested in why these two things might develop at sort of different rates. And we're peeling it back to the kind of most basic level, looking at speech sounds and how those are related in perception and production during learning. But other labs have been working on the kind of higher up stuff. So how words and sentences and grammar are related in perception and production. So there's some really nice work out of, for example, Mary Ellen McDonald's lab at University of Wisconsin, where Elise Hopman, one of her students, is looking at those issues.
How does speech production differ between native and non-native speakers?
Yeah, so this is also something we're trying to unpack the specifics of. What we know for sure is that native speakers and non-native speakers produce speech in different ways. So we know that your first language, if you are a non-native speaker, will impact how you produce your second language. There's some sort of general properties of second language speech. It tends to be slower than native language speech, and it tends to deviate on sort of all levels. By that, I mean like segments tend to be different. So the actual sounds tend to be different, sometimes in more or less systematic ways. The prosody, or the kind of rhythm and pitch and intonation information, also differs. And of course, non-native speakers don't have the same vocabulary that native speakers do in all cases. And so there might be differences in words or in grammatical structure. So how we put together a sentence. And all of those things are influenced by our first language, for sure, but they're also influenced by the sort of challenge of trying to communicate in your second language, which is, as many of your listeners I'm sure know, is a real challenge, right? It's something that's a really hard thing to do.
Just beyond just the individual sound, if you just take one sentence in your non-native language and you say it, and as someone who is a native speaker says it, it might, the melody might sound completely different. Well, melody, is that the right word for that? Yeah. So just because it'll be influenced by your first language.
Yeah. And, even if you get almost all of the sounds almost exactly right, people are really good at telling if somebody's a native or a non-native speaker. There's one study, and I can find the citation to send it to you all, where if you just play a T burst for somebody, like the burst of the sound T, right? And this is, I think, French speakers, people can tell at a much greater than chance level if somebody's a native or a non-native speaker, which is totally wild, right? So we have all of these cues that somebody is or isn't a native speaker, and those cues are used by listeners. And I think that's a really important thing to know in production. We're not just listening to the speech for the actual speech sounds. We're also using it, as you all have talked about a bunch, to figure out other things about the speaker, who they are in terms of their identity. And one of the clearest things, one of the things people are sort of best at, is telling whether somebody is a native speaker of the language or not.
So how about speech perception? How does that differ between native and non-native speakers?
Yeah, so again, this differs pretty substantially, influenced by our first language. So, for example, the most famous case study is Japanese RNL, right? So, or RNL in English, rather, for Japanese listeners. So it is a really tricky thing for Japanese listeners to tell the difference between RNL. And we think that's probably because the cue that signals RNL in English, which is the third formant for anybody who's caring about phonetics. If you don't care about phonetics, it's fine. There's a cue in the speech signal that differs, which is the F3. That cue is not used meaningfully in Japanese to differentiate speech sounds. And so if you're a listener from Japanese trying to learn English, you have to learn to pay attention to something that you have never really paid attention to before. And that's a really, really challenging thing. Anytime you're learning any new skill, trying to pay attention to something that you haven't paid attention to before is probably the hardest thing, right?
Especially since, so thinking about developmentally, we narrow down our sounds as babies. If we are hearing babies in the first 6 months, it's like vowels, and then the first year it's consonants. So like we, of course, are able to recognize all sounds when we're babies if we are hearing. But then it narrows very quickly. So the fact that all of these things, like there are cues to know if someone hasn't been using this language their whole life, it makes sense because
it does make sense, right? And there's a reason why we see that narrowing, which is there's so much variation in speech in general, and you have to know what variation to pay attention to and what variation to ignore. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do speech perception. And so you're just literally not going to be able to do it. And so narrowing our categories into these really fine-tuned categories for our first language is a super useful thing, but it's really hard to sort of unwind that and make our categories either broader or able to be developed into a two-language system instead of a single language system.
Yeah, and I think it's important. This is not a thing where this is not a thing where non-native speakers are not capable, humans. It's a thing where it's like, oh no, your brain is doing exactly what it needed to do. And so, exactly. Unwinding that is very, very difficult.
It's something that we forget when we're listening to non-native speakers, that they are native speakers in another language,
exactly,
right? And that they are able to communicate the way I'm communicating with you all right now without a ton of conscious effort and a ton of conscious thought. We're able to do that in our native language. And as soon as you put somebody in a second language, that job becomes so much harder. There's a great quote from Javier Bardem when he was interviewed on Fresh Air.
There is this office in my brain full of people working at the same time that I'm talking to you, trying to not, be wrong with the intonation, with the words. So it's very exhausting.
The office is translating, right? Okay.
Exactly. If I speak Spanish, that office is closed. There's nobody in the office. I'm fine by my own.
He talks about how when he's communicating in English, it's like having an office full of people who are in his head, who are trying to make sure that nothing goes out the door before it's been fact checked. But when he's speaking in Spanish, that office is closed, right? He doesn't need the office full of people. And I love that analogy because it really, I think, brings home the point of how challenging this is and how much work it is to communicate in your second language.
Mm-hmm. That is a really good metaphor, and that is exactly how I feel whenever I'm trying to speak in any other language but English.
Yeah.
Isn't it non-native speech harder to understand than native speech?
Yeah, so it is harder to understand. We know this about speech that we're unfamiliar with in general. So an unfamiliar talker is harder to understand than a familiar talker. You see this, for example, with parents with little kids, right? They can understand their kids totally fine, and you may not be able to understand their little kid as well.
Yeah, when someone's like, "Oh, he just said this," I'm like, "Did he?"
Right. So we're very good at understanding familiar talkers. We're very good at understanding familiar accents and dialects, and we're less good at doing that when it's unfamiliar. And again, this is just a practice thing, right? So we have experience doing this particular skill, and when we have to step outside of that particular skill, it gets a little bit harder. I think we'll probably get into this in a bit, but it's not prohibitively harder. And that's the sort of message I'm interested in spreading.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Us too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it before. Like, it's just a matter of listening. But yeah. So how do language ideologies or attitudes impact our understanding of non-native speech?
It's a good question. It's something that, I sort of have exasperated Sai here because much more so than I think, would like them to. So, there's been a lot of great work ranging from Ruben's work to Kevin McGowan's work, looking at how just looking at a non-native speaker or someone who you think is probably going to be a non-native speaker impacts your perception. And we know, especially from Kevin's work, that that's probably grounded in expectation. If you expect to hear an accent, if you see somebody who you expect to be accented, you're likely to perceive them as, in fact, being accented. If you see somebody who is accented and you hear something that is not accented, that often can be, or if you see rather a person who you expect not to be accented and hear accented speech, that can also be disorienting for people. And so I'm using accented here to mean non-native accented, not in the like native speakers don't have an accent sense. I just want to make that perfectly clear. So we know that impacts things a lot. We also know that there are tons of individual differences in terms of people's ability to understand unfamiliar speech. And these individual differences can be driven by things like cognitive skills. So, how big your vocabulary is can impact how well you're able to understand unfamiliar speech. But they can also be influenced by social factors like attitudes toward non-native speakers. And so we've done some work, a couple of instructors at the American English Institute, which is our ESL program here at University of Oregon. And I have done some work looking at how attitudes impact a score we call comprehensibility. So when you're talking about speech perception, especially of longer sentences, you can divvy this up into a few pots, right? So you can talk about how accented someone is, and that's just a sort of subjective measure of how accented do you think the speech is. You can talk about intelligibility, which is how many words are you correctly able to transcribe. And then you can ask people a question about comprehensibility or ease of understanding. How hard is it to understand this speech? And what we found is that even when people have exactly the same intelligibility scores, so they're able to transcribe the speech perfectly fine, you see comprehensibility scores differ. So their ability or their sort of feeling about how easy the task was differs. And the primary factor that predicted performance on that comprehensibility task was attitude about non-native speakers, which is, a huge bummer because they're able to actually understand the speech, but they feel like it's really hard. And so one thing we're interested in doing, and one of my former students, Drew McLaughlin, is now doing this work at Washington University in St. Louis, looking at actual listening effort. How much effort are these people putting in using physiological measures, things like pupillometry, right? Where we can see how much effort people are putting into these tasks. Because, when I first saw these results, I wanted to figure out a way to make them slightly less depressing. And one potential option is you have a bad attitude about non-native speech because it is objectively harder for you to understand. It's harder for you for maybe cognitive reasons, and those cognitive reasons might actually impact you having a negative attitude. It could be this sort of vicious cycle where it's really hard for you to understand, and so you're frustrated by that because we're frustrated when we can't communicate as well as we'd like to. So you're frustrated, you spend more effort doing this task, the more effort makes you tireder, and we all know that when we're tired, we're really crabby. So you're crabby about spending more effort, and that makes you have a bad attitude about this. I'm not sure about the causality in that direction. People could just be jerks, but I think that there's something to be said about trying to unpack this idea of how much effort people feel like they're putting forth and how much effort they are actually physiologically putting forth.
So are they putting forth more effort?
So we haven't tied the attitude piece to the effort piece yet because Drew has been doing some really amazing work on pupillometry. We do know that even for fully intelligible speech, so this is non-native speech that everybody can understand really clearly, Drew and her advisor have been doing work that shows that pupillometry measures demonstrate that people are putting forth more effort when they're listening to non-native speech, even if it is fully intelligible. So we're not making it too hard for them. It's just more effortful, and that makes sense, right? It is something that deviates from the norm, and we have to probably put forth a little more effort to understand.
Or has anyone also studied like different dialects of English that are still native and how much effort you have to put forth? Because I'm just thinking my experience, like one of my grandmother's cousins, I could barely understand him. He was Scottish. His wife I could understand, who was also Scottish. And they like grew up pretty close together, so it was interesting. But yeah, it's just how much effort I had to put into understanding this person who spoke English.
Right. Well, Well, so a few things there. One is there have been a bunch of studies that have shown that there are gender differences in intelligibility. So women tend to be more intelligible than men. For a lot of reasons, including potentially socialization reasons. But, that's speculation on my part. I'm not sure if there's been a lot of work on effort and unfamiliar dialects, but there is plenty of work on perception of unfamiliar dialects, including some of our work. This is work jointly with Tessa Bent at Indiana and Stephanie Borey at Utah State and Kristen Benning and at WashU in St. Louis, where we've looked at how perception of unfamiliar dialects correlates with perception of non-native speech. And we show that on some metrics it does correlate, on others it doesn't. It sort of makes sense because, as you pointed out, Carrie, they are in fact native speakers of the language. And so there are some things that they're doing that are probably distinct from what makes non-native speech hard to understand. But it is the case that even for unfamiliar dialects, it's going to be a really challenging thing for listeners to hear and to understand. And probably some of that is the effort piece. Probably some of that is expectation. And those two things are probably linked in interesting ways as well. So there's a lot still to be examined. If anybody's looking for a career, this is a great one.
So one of the reasons why I even thought of this, I think it's the British quiz show QI, which has Stephen Fry. They had a Geordie speaker on, and the Geordie speaker said something like, cunny something.
They make a cunny noise like.
I beg your pardon?
Ferns make a cunny noise.
And it sounds like cunt to us. Mm-hmm. But what he was actually saying was canny. But Stephen Fry also misheard it. And so there was this whole conversation. Yeah, so I found that really fascinating because I thought Stephen Fry would be more likely to know the Geordie accent than me. And
right.
He was on the same footing as me, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also the case that, these things get harder the less sort of context you have or the less frequency with which you hear the word. So maybe canny isn't a word that comes up a lot. So he hasn't had an opportunity to hear that particular thing. And, perhaps for him, the other lexical item is more frequent. Who knows? I mean, yes. There's a bunch of possibilities there, but, I think it's a really nice example of how all of these factors come into play. When we're listening to speech, we use every tool available to us. And so some of those tools are things like, what is the most likely word that this person has said? And canny is a very low frequency word. So
yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly right.
And so that goes back to how you said that vocabulary size will affect how you perceive non-native speech. So that makes a lot of sense. The thing that I think about automatically, and it's because you're at a university and, this is where so many people, and myself included, were introduced to so many different non-native speakers speaking English and et cetera, is at university. And that might be the first time. And these are also your subject pool, right?
Yeah.
So I also wonder about the opposite, where we have students that are not native speakers of English having to listen to professors that are.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about how hard they're working to learn new information and to listen to something that's not their first language.
Right. This is a challenge in education, broadly speaking, right? For both languages and dialects. If you put a person in a classroom, whether they're a college student or a 5-year-old, with somebody who doesn't speak a language or dialect that they're used to hearing, they're going to have to work much, much harder. I almost said twice as hard that it sounded like I was quantifying effort. Much, much harder than people who have the benefit of having their language or dialect match the faculty members or the instructors. And of course, this is going to have costs, right? In terms of content that you're able to learn. And this is true, I think, across the educational system. It's particularly marked in college students, I think, because, we're expecting college students in general to function at such a high level. And I personally cannot imagine attending college in a language other than my native language. I think it would have been extraordinarily difficult. And so whenever I encounter students as an instructor who are doing this, I try to approach them with as much sort of sympathy as I can, because they're doing something that I am certainly not brave enough to do. And many of their peers are certainly not brave enough to do. And so trying to be really patient about the fact that they are doing something that to me feels impossible, and doing it actually with quite high levels of success, that is astonishing.
And I think it's just a very important thing to remember when we're looking at our peers too. Like if you're college kids, listening to the college kids, like I'm so far removed from it. But yeah, like just thinking, what is it? Like you just don't really know what people are going through. But I think about that a lot when listening to speech, because yeah, like think about how hard that is. How hard is it to learn organic chemistry, and then you're doing it with like, it's another yeah.
Exactly. And I think that is something that, a lot of people are just, they don't think about, because we think about maybe the outward things a little bit more, and language is so automatic for us that we don't really think about the challenges. They already learned English. They're here. They've learned English. Everything's fine, but not realizing how challenging it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love suggesting study abroad for students who are able to study abroad, especially in a country that is not an English-speaking country, because I think it develops so much empathy in students who are able to go somewhere, even for very brief periods of time, where communication is a challenge for them, and where they are now in a situation where they cannot communicate as fluently as they would like to communicate.
And when their brain is constantly working, and you're just like so much more tired.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I have never slept so well as I did when I moved to Spain and started being surrounded by Spanish all the time. It was so exhausting. And I mean, you're jet lagged and all the rest as well, but I was so exhausted just from trying to unpack what was going on around me that I took for granted in the US.
I wonder if that's a little bit of what's happening. So yeah, like I said, this, maybe you're living in a bubble, and that could look like whatever, or sound like whatever it was. You go to university, and then you're a native speaker of English, and the professor is a non-native speaker of English. You're just not used to being placed in that position, because you have been living in some sort of sound bubble.
Yeah.
So that might be really frustrating for you.
Yeah, and I think it is. So I think it is really frustrating for students. We have more than anecdotal evidence that it's frustrating for students. So we have a year or so ago, the advising office at UO contacted me and some other folks and said, we're getting all of these complaints from students. We're getting complaints from parents about non-native, especially TAs, but also instructors in general. What can we do about this? And this is where some of the training work that I've been doing comes into play, because we've done some kind of scientific studies suggesting that if you just practice, you can get better at understanding unfamiliar speech, especially non-native speech. And when I say practice, the trainings that we've done have been 30 minutes a day for 2 days. And we showed really robust generalization to novel talkers and to novel accents. And so, for me, that's an hour of work. And it's concerted work, right? You're transcribing all of the speech and really practicing, trying to understand the speech. But you get percentage point gains in intelligibility that are quite high, right? And so one thing we've been developing is some training for students that help them understand both what the non-native speaker is going through. So some basic sort of literacy about how hard it is to understand or how hard it is to communicate in your second language, rather. We do some basic literacy about the fact that it is hard to understand non-native speech. So validating their sort of intuition that this is a challenging thing, but then showing them that you can get better at it. And I think, that has been a really important thing for us to share, both with advisors and with students and parents, to help them understand, all of the social pieces that go into this, as well as the kind of cognitive pieces. And one thing we've been doing that I sort of love that we've managed to include. So a lot of our students are motivated, as any humans are, by external sort of motivators. And so one of the things we've talked about is the fact that this is a skill that you can use when you're applying for jobs, right? So if you can tell an employer, a potential employer, I also have experience communicating across language barriers. That's something that is really important if you're working for a global company or even for a company that has any diversity in it at all. If you're able to communicate with individuals, or at least are willing to try, right? You're going to be more successful than somebody who is focused on native English only.
I love that so much. And I'm thinking about what a training might like. You're a freshman coming into university, just as an example again of college. And instead of at the welcoming event or whatever, instead of talking about the pitfalls, it could be more of like another exciting thing that's going to happen to you is that you're going to be introduced to so many different people that speak in so many different ways. And it might be a little bit hard at first, but that's normal. If only someone had I don't think that I really needed to hear that at that point, because I understood that, I think, at 18. I understand it more now. But if someone would have said that, it still would have been like, oh, I love that someone's saying that. I feel like that would have been very validating for so many people.
Yeah. And I think so. We've been working, and it's of course slow because universities are huge bureaucracies, but we've been working with the folks at orientation, which we, because we're Oregon, call introduction with a DUCK because of the ducks.
Wow. Okay, that's kind of cute.
Yeah, it is pretty adorable. Introduction, and also working with some folks on our web design team to come up with ways to include this in really early on communication with students. So one of the things we're interested in doing is developing a sort of online training that's a sneaky training. So click here to learn some facts about the University of Oregon. And we have those facts being delivered, not just by native speakers, but also by non-native speakers in a variety of dialects. So you get just a little practice listening to those things and understanding them in sort of sneaky ways, but also being very clear to students that it is an exciting thing. We're at a global international university that attracts students from all over the world and attracts the best faculty from all over the world. That's the other thing we try to frame. Your faculty and your TAs know a lot, even if they are not able to communicate with you the way that, maybe a native English speaker is able to communicate with you. And as part of that benefit, you also have this challenge, which is trying a little bit harder to understand what these people are saying.
What would you recommend to people who are not in this environment? So, you're not a freshman student coming to your university, but you still want to learn how to improve your communication with someone who speaks a non-English language as their first language.
So I think, again, the answer is to practice. And there's a bunch of different kind of creative ways you can go about practicing. With YouTube now, you can find accented speech all over the place. There are other great resources that are open source. So the Speech Accent Archive is one of those. At George Mason University, Northwestern University has a bunch of freely available non-native speech that you can listen to and practice. And you can think about why you want to get better at it, right? So is it the case that you have a friend who is a native Mandarin speaker and you just want to get better at understanding that person's speech? Well, one really good way to do that is hang out with that friend more and practice with that friend more, right? Is it the case that you have a big community of Spanish speakers in your area and you don't speak Spanish, and maybe you're trying to learn Spanish, but you still want to be able to communicate with people whose native language is Spanish? Well, then listen to a lot of Spanish accented English. So we know that if you train on a single accent, you get better at that accent. And if you want something that's broader, practice across a wide variety of accents, and you'll, we think, improve at novel accents as well. So you can sort of target your practice to whatever you're most interested in doing. But there's plenty of ways to do that both in person and online. And I think one thing non-native speakers really appreciate is if somebody says to them, I am having a hard time understanding you, but I want to get better at it. So can we practice more? Can I talk to you more often? I think non-native speakers would be happy to hear that instead of what they are typically experience, which is this sort of shutting them down because they are not as fluent as a native English speaker.
Or told to get rid of their accent.
Or told to get rid of their accent. And this is a thing that I think one of the most frustrating things to me about perception of non-native speech is, as you all are very familiar in Arizona, the US has this big push toward English only, right? In a variety of domains, and insisting that if you live in the United States, you should speak English. And of course, there are many, many, many problems with that viewpoint, which you all have covered in great detail. But I think one of the things that is so frustrating to me is that even when people do speak English, right, they have learned English, it's not enough, because they're not native English speakers. And so then we start to see it's not really a problem with the language at all, right? It's never been about Spanish. It's never been about Spanish accented English. It's about the people. And, that to me is super sad and really frustrating, but I would like to give an opportunity to people who it's not the people, right? They just feel like non-native speech is hard to understand. An opportunity to them to say, we're asking people to do a lot by communicating with us in English. And so why don't we do just a little bit? My student Drew, who I mentioned before, has this great analogy that she came up with that I love, which is if you think about communication like moving a couch, right? If you ask one person to move a couch, it is going to be slow. It's going to be a really awkward process. Your floor is going to get all scraped up from the couch getting dragged around the house, right? But if you have two people lift the couch, it doesn't mean that it's easy, right? It doesn't mean that suddenly moving the couch is something that's like, a day in the park, but you're able to do the task, right? It's easier when the communicative burden is shared across two parties. And so I think even though you have to do a little bit of work, recognizing the huge amount of work that the other party is doing is something that to me is sort of a no-brainer in terms of I want to do that for communication, right? And I think most people want to make communication be easier, especially when they realize the burden that the other person is kind of carrying in this case.
Oh yeah, that's a really great metaphor as well.
Yeah, it's a lovely one.
Well, and it's really helpful because then, I hope that this episode at least is just like one step in that direction. Although our listeners are already like taking those steps, but exactly. It's kind of that thing where you're like, okay, now that I know this, maybe I've been placing too much either blame or like just trying to figure out what the problem is and putting it on the person instead of like a situation or whatever it is. Like, just like how when we discriminate against language, it's not just about language, it's about the person. We need to kind of like separate those two things so that we aren't blaming people.
Right. And I think, being very clear, I teach a class called Language and Power, even though I'm not a sociolinguist. It's my favorite class to teach because our tagline, even before you all came around, was also "Don't be an asshole."
Really? Nice.
Class.
Really?
So, I love teaching that class. And I think one of the things that I end the class by talking about is, I'm not saying you can't make any judgments about language. We all make judgments about language all the time. There's stuff you like, there's stuff you don't like, there's stuff that's frustrating, but being aware of what those judgments are and whether or not they're actually judgments about language. Are they judgments about language or are they judgments about people? And being able to unpack that for yourself or for the people around you is something that I think is so critically important, because we make these judgments about language and we pretend like they're just about language and they're easy fixes, right? But we would never, ever, ever, ever tell anybody to change their race, right? That's not an acceptable thing to say. But to say like, get rid of your accent. That's something that people say. That's something people make money on, right? People make lots and lots of money helping people get rid of their accents, which is, to me, a little bit horrifying, but I won't dive into that well today. But I think, being aware of what we are asking people to do and what we're asking people to do, especially for non-native speakers who are not always here by choice, right? Who are not always speaking English by choice. And the fact that we're asking them to change something about their identity that's so fundamental to who they are, that to me is something we should be thinking very carefully about as we do it.
Absolutely.
I think you've already kind of said it, but is there like one main point that you feel is important that you could tell our listeners so we can all be less of an asshole about all of this?
Yeah. I think that just recognizing that it takes two to tango, right? It takes two people to communicate, and recognizing that both sides have some responsibility for the communication to be successful, I think is the most important takeaway from this work.
Yeah, I love that. One of our guests, Ake, said, be good and be kind. And yeah, as, you know, we say don't be an asshole, and we really mean it. And I think that really helps, like, kind of relieve tension too when we say don't be an asshole, but be good and be kind just like gets me in the feels, like in my heart. And it's like, don't you want to be good and be kind?
Yeah. I mean, just putting like a little bit of niceness into the world. If you can do something that is so like, me trying a little harder to understand non-native speech is such a tiny thing.
Yeah.
And so
tiny. Yeah.
Why not just do this little tiny thing that makes somebody's life a little bit easier? Because, you know, one thing we didn't get into today, and I don't want to go into too much detail about, is some of the true horror stories people have about trying to communicate in their non-native language and the things that people say and do to them to shut them down. You know, bringing just a little bit of kindness back into those communicative scenarios, I think, is critically important.
Absolutely.
I agree. This has been a really great conversation. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we hit all of the big picture things that I'm really excited to talk about, and the things that I think are really ignored, I think, by a lot of our society. So I'm super happy you all have this podcast. It is assigned as extra credit to my Language and Power students because it is so relevant for them, and it's always exciting when they come in with, you know, they've gone through your back catalog and found something that they're really excited about.
Oh, that's amazing.
I really
I love that.
Yeah, I appreciate the work you all are doing. I know it's not, you cover so many topics that are not easy topics, but I'm super impressed with the work that you all have been doing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I know that I'm impressed with the work you're doing in Oregon.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. It's been wonderful.
Everyone,
don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
We would like to thank our newest patrons from December.
And y'all are the ones that helped us go over the goal we had, right?
Yeah, so we finally met our second goal. So going forward, so from this episode on, we can transcribe our episodes.
Yay!
And if you want to help us meet our third goal, which is to pay for previous episodes.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I'm doing them, but I would rather pay someone else to do them because it's not my favorite thing to do.
Yeah.
You can also join us. But first, let's thank our newest patrons. Kyle Wilkinson.
Yay.
Shiloh Drake.
Shiloh.
Yeah.
I know you.
Stephen Murphy.
Yay.
Mike Mina. And Adam Hartzell. So if anyone wants to join us at patreon.com/vocalfriespod, you can join us at the $5, $3, or $2 level. We changed it from 1 to 2 because Patreon takes such a big chunk of the $1. So, but $3 and $5, you get a sticker. Actually, you get multiple stickers over time. And the $5 level, you get bonus episodes. So, yeah, thank you. The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.